Thank you very much, Scott. Our next speaker is Joyce Shingle, Wigwe, former legal advisor to the Minister of Power in Nigeria, and we're kind of getting to the end, so she's gonna give us a 6-minute presentation because she's going to be very efficient.
I'll try. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, CCA Africa, for having me speak at this forum. The topic of my presentation is regulation as an enabler to private sector investment. And I'm going to borrow from what Ron had said in his last presentation, which was that Ontario generates 60,000 megawatts for a 12 million population in Ontario, while Nigeria generates 5,000 for 160 million. Now, having that at the back of our mind, it just means that there is enormous potential in Nigeria for investors coming into Nigeria. Now, my presentation is going to be in 3 forms. Firstly, I'm going to tell you where we were, what we've done, and where we're heading. The essence of this is to bring to your consciousness the extent of metamorphosis that the Nigerian power sector has gone through, and to tell you that the government is doing something about it, and this is the time actually to be able to clock in. Otherwise, you'll probably miss it. Right. And why do I say this? My experience is I've worked as a lawyer, schooled in the United States of America at Stanford University. I've worked in the international sector. I've worked in England. I've worked in America. And I do have a fair idea of what international standards are. Prior to this, I was in the public sector and happened to author a book known as the Public-Private Partnership. So I do understand exactly what is required. With that in mind, I was co-opted to actually work with Professor Naji's team, the former minister, on setting up a framework for electricity reform in Nigeria. When we started off, we noticed that there were several issues that plagued the industry. Right, firstly, the privatization had been stalled, which means that the EPSRA, which was the Electric Power Sector Reform Act of 2005, had been stalled from being implemented. That we had a weak regulator, which was a result of the fact that the previous commissioners had been suspended, and there were no commissioners that had been reappointed. Consequently, there was a lack of a cost-reflective tariff because of the vertically integrated electricity sector. We lacked creditworthiness of successor companies, which meant that, of course, investors could not get their return on investments if they ever invested in those companies. There was no strategy for dealing with labor issues. Neither was there any strategy for dealing with accrued liabilities. Now, the NIPP projects, which is the National Integrated Power Projects to build 10 new power plants, had been stalled as well, which meant that additional capacity was not being generated in the country. Now, there was also no clear directive as to how to get gas to the power stations. With these problems that plague Nigeria power industry, the next question was how we're going to deal with it. So what we did was that my team, as me being the legal advisor in the team, we had to set up a framework, what is known as the building blocks, to be able to set this thing in motion, the reform in motion. And what it took into consideration was the service delivery as well as privatization. So the first thing that was done was to set up the road map plan. So the roadmap plan was, of course, twofold. When it came to service delivery, of course, what we talked about was to see how we could strengthen the successor companies. And then when it came to reform, we had to recommence privatization. Now, in addition to this was the pertinence of the regulator. A regulator needed to be set in place, a strengthened regulator, an independent regulator that would actually push the market forward with adequate regulation to enable private sector investments come into being. Now, with the regulator in place, the regulator had to work to determine what the cost-reflective tariff. If the tariff wasn't cost-reflective, of course, this impacted whether or not you would have investors interested in your transaction or not. So we had the regulator, NERC, look at the cost-reflective tariff. In looking at that, of course, they had to take into consideration the price of gas coming down upstream and the price of transmission as well, and every other factor, like my colleague earlier on talked about, that is taken into consideration to be able to come up with a cost-reflective tariff. So that was the review of the MITO, which was the multi-year tariff order. In addition to that, they had to look into things such as what do we do with electricity theft? Hitherto, there were no laws on electricity theft, so which meant there were illegal connections and tampering of meters. So NERC had to look at that as well. So you could see that there were now so many issues the regulator had to put in place, and that was the essence of putting that in place, so that a private sector coming into investing in the company would be able to see how to structure, how to ensure, would be able to have the confidence of investing in there, knowing very well that he'll be able to get adequate return on his investments and that his investments will not get lost in cost of transmission or distribution. Now, in addition to this, what they needed to take on was hitherto we had a subsidy application and mechanism in place where government actually subsidized for electricity. So this had to be phased out gradually. So the regulator as well had to look into that to be able to see how do we implement tariff, how do we implement the subsidy so that it goes to those who actually need the subsidy and not to the rich. So they had to come up with a mechanism for that as well. And they also had to come up with a mechanism as to how to apply this subsidy. Should it be applied straight to the successor companies, or should it just be, should it go down the government, should it go down to the market operator, then to the distribution companies and all that. So it all depends what was the mechanism for disbursement of the subsidy. That needed to have been looked into as well. So the regulator, of course, has been busy looking into all of this. While this was going on, we did realize that, well, the successor companies lacked creditworthiness. And of course, if they lacked creditworthiness, no one was going to actually buy the successor companies. So what did we do? Government managed to secure a guarantee from the World Bank, known as the World Bank PRG. In securing this, they had to securitize a special trader, which had to be a government agency. So the bulk trader was put in place, which had to be the go-between between the generator and the successor companies. So that's known as the Nigerian Bulk Electricity Trading Company. In short form is the bulk trader. So the bulk trader now had to create a trading arrangement between the generation and the distribution. So the bulk trader buys the power from the generation companies and then sells it to the distribution companies. That way, it began to set the catalyst in place for the electricity competitive market to take off. Right, in addition to this, like I said, we had to restart privatization with the bulk trader in place, the regulator in place. It was now time to actually begin to sell these companies. Then we thought of the fact that, well, we now had so many liabilities accruing from the companies because hitherto everything, it was vertically integrated and the government had to run the entire thing. So of course it tells you how inefficient it was. And of course when the revenue, they never had enough revenue to be even pay the salaries of the staff. So what we had to do was that we had to think of who's going to take care of these liabilities. So government set in place what's known as NELMCO. NELMCO is the National Electricity Liabilities Company, Management Company. So all the liabilities automatically transfer to NELMCO so that the companies are actually sold clean with a clean balance sheet from the on-go, with government assuming the liabilities, assuming the responsibility for taking care of the liabilities. So with NELMCO in place, we also had to think, of course, the most important factor, labor, human resources. What do you do about them? Hitherto as well, because it has been a government agency, found out that the staffing was, we had more staff and, of course, ghost workers, as you would expect, because, of course, this was run by government as against private sector. So there was no efficiency in the skills that were being employed and in the deployment of staff. So we had to think again as how do you deal with labor? How do you lay off some staff to be able to hand over a company whose balance sheet and whose staff is commensurate with that, which revenue that was being generated by the company as well? Because of course this fed into the cost reflective tariff which the regulator had to deal with. So that as well is being worked on. Then when it came to transmission, we realized that the national grid, we only have one national grid, unlike what our colleagues in Ontario said. So we only have one, which meant that we couldn't quite sell this, or we're not in a position to actually privatize this in terms of complete sale. So what the government did was to have a management contractor able to run and manage the services to a point where when it's efficiently run and can run by itself, then it would be in a position to actually ask for it to be privatized in terms of wholesale. So I've talked about clarity of trading arrangements, I've talked about electricity tariff bills, and of course, drafting of the Way-Live Bill. We do realize that in most developing countries, there is the Way-Live Bill that actually gives priority to utility projects, so that issues such as land and so if private investors need land and all that, it's given priority with the state government and federal government. So of course, we do have that being worked on as well by the regulator. And like I said before, we had to secure a gas PRG in order to ensure that the multinational corporations were paid for gas that was disbursed. Now, having taken into consideration the building blocks that were put in place, you would see that with all the work that had been done, which was like the framework for electric power reform, and needless to say, I forgot to add that the NIPP projects now actually came back and started working as well, so that would be able to generate additional capacity. With that in mind, the issue was that we're now ready to sell, and we now started selling. But in spite of that, as you would expect, bidders still had more issues coming on, which of course, some of which we hadn't thought of and some of which we could not address. Questions such as, why do we have what do we do about the limited history of NERC as an institution? That we can't do anything about because, I mean, it's there. And then they had questions of issues such as the question methodology for tariff calculation as not clearly stated in the license. They wanted to be assured of regulatory certainty and consistency. The laws will not change overnight on them. They wanted to ensure that the methodology for changing of tariff was made clear and certain, as against each company having to go and apply for a change when it could make a case for itself. So, all of these issues are things that we're still, that we're still grappling with. And so the issues keep coming up because it's a process that is still being cleaned through. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Ron. Right, so all of these issues are issues that we're grappling with as teething problems in Nigeria. As you would expect, this has only just started. And so I know that people say, oh, well, we still don't have light in Nigeria, we still have these challenges. But remember that these are baby steps we're taking, and these are issues we're grappling with. And I believe that every nation has to go through these issues in order to be able to get to where they are today. And so we're taking great steps, and all of this is being said to bring to your consciousness the extent to which the government has gone to be able to bring it to where it is today, and to be able to say that the opportunities in future are actually quite good and huge, and we must be able to tap into that. Right. With the sale of the assets so far, it's not to say that we understand that all the issues are taken care of, but the fact that we do know that there are post-privatization issues that would come up because the laws are still being reviewed. We are going to have issues. We anticipate issues such as asset ownership, for example, when it comes to discos distribution companies, who owns what lines, where does your line start and stop, where does mine start and stop. So we're going to have to clean up on issues like that. We're going to have to think of due diligence to determine true asset base, because hitherto, yes, due diligence has been conducted, but now when the companies go back, the NERC is going to have to do better due diligence, because as things become clearer, it becomes easier to be able to tell clearly exactly what the revenue base is, what exactly is the asset base of the company, to be able to make proper calculations and realistic calculations going forward. Then issues such as the unpaid past receivables that have to do with tampered megas and illegal connections all have to be clarified, because as each company now has its own lines. All of those issues, all those blurred areas are going to come up, and we have to clarify them as well. Clear investment terms need to be determined to be able to know what figures to put into the cost, to determine the cost-reflective tariff. Companies are going to have to be able to work with NERC to be able to determine exactly what their investment, what their revenue base is, and what their investment terms are, to be able to have a proper calculation of what the tariff is, which means that the cost-reflective tariff is going to go through changes as well. So we have these issues, post-privatization issues coming up, but political will and continuous international expectations actually do help, because they help actually to set the government. It helps to keep the government on track as well. So fora like this are very important to help Nigeria move forward as well. Now, going forward, what do we see as changes going forward? With these building blocks in place and these issues, what do we see going forward? Short term, of course, we do see that, issues arising from those building blocks are still going to come up, and we're going to have to address them. We're going to have to address companies. Companies are going to be under closer scrutiny by market participants and by users as well. And and states and federal governments are going to have to relate even more to be able to prioritize on land and other issues that are of common interest to both parties. And of course, the cost of tariff, which hitherto has been cost of gas, is going to have to be more clearly put into the tariff, because hitherto the cost of transmission of gas has not been very clear, because government had borne so that has been sort of a blurred area to determine how much we should charge for transportation of gas, and not the gas molecules in this case. Right, medium term, we do hope that bilateral contracts will be created, and DISCOs, as they go on competitive markets, will be set in place. DISCOs can then actually be in a position to be able to enter into contracts with GENCOs without, needing the bulk trader in between. And hopefully there will be reduction in transmission losses as efficiency and stability improves in the system. So long term, of course, is there'll be efficiency in electricity delivery, and then companies can then consumers can then determine which utility companies they need to use, just like they have here in Canada. Which utility company do I need to use? Do I want to provide electricity to me, and which one would I rather not have provide electricity to me? So now these are the changes we've seen going forward. Lessons learned from Canada. Canada, like Ron and Scott they talked about Ontario and Canada. Canada runs a slightly different system, like we saw. Provinces here, essentially, while it's Ontario, it's a hybrid system. But provinces all have their boards, have their electricity boards. While in Nigeria, we still have just NERC that's dealing with. But over there, different provinces have different, and the cost of electricity, differs. With province. While in Nigeria, I believe the cost of electricity is about the same, because of political reasons. Run 2 more minutes. Because of political reasons and all. So we can't quite say, Port Harcourt is going to have a different electricity price from the north because of political reasons, because, in spite of the fact that transmission, probably cheaper because of, how long it takes for us to connect to the grid and the distance covered and how much electricity, gets trickled down. So we do have that as well. However, Nigeria and Canada do have some common challenges. Of course, new infrastructure. Each country constantly wants to have new infrastructure to clean up the system to get it better. We have energy efficiency issues. Everybody wants to be able to determine, let's make our energy more efficient to be able to get more returns on our investment. Standards for power reliability. I think Canada has moved a bit forward because they've at least determined that, we're going to set in place certain standards for power reliability, which they've given to the companies, which the companies are going to have to work with. And then, of course, quality of power. Canada is so way ahead because, they have a system that's able to determine, the quality of power. Companies have to adhere to certain qualities. Now, in addition to that, certain things Nigeria must borrow from is standards. While laying standards for Nigeria presently has no standards for equipment that are being brought into the country. So we must set standards to be able to ensure that we protect our environment. Canada is so way ahead. Canada is heavy on protecting the environment. So they have standards laid for equipment that is brought into the country and the quality of the equipment. So they have, for example, standardized with ISO standards, standards for equipment that pertain to electricity sector. And they are heavy on, issues that pertain to the environment as well, power reliability and all that. And, they're building more recent equipment to overcome long distance hurdles in transmission, so that instead of us to have dimmer light as we go further down, Canada is able to maintain the quality of the light regardless of the distance of where you live from the grid. So we have to borrow this from Canada and, learn from that. Of course, in conclusion, therefore, it means that Nigeria, like I said earlier on, is grappling with issues. But what I think I'm hoping I've succeeded in doing is to bring to yourself the consciousness of how far government has gone to be able to achieve what we've achieved, and to say that it just shows that tremendous opportunities abound. And with the data we have regarding the megawatts we have, vis-a-vis the population, it should only act to galvanize and get us, it should actually, get us to ensure that we actually do meet this, and that we actually have investors willing to come in and invest in the field, because the government is actually willing and ready to be able to run with this. We have to copy certain things Ontario has done, so that at least fora like this will be of benefit to the country. And but like I said, the constant problem both countries face is that there is constantly a balance of quality of service vis-a-vis the price, and continued investments in the sector. And this happens all over the world. So there is constantly, countries are constantly grappling with how to balance all of this. So in essence, what I hope I have succeeded in conveying is the fact that there are opportunities in Nigeria, and I believe that, with the right partners, no Canadian company can actually go wrong investing in Nigeria in the long term. Thank you.